Producers want to maximize profit. Consumers want to maximize utility. What do you want? To maximize profit or to maximize utility? Are you a producer or consumer? Producers produce goods and services, consumers consume goods and services. Suppose you want to start a business. You should have a product or service to offer. How do you identify that product or service? You need to go to the market and find out the product or service which will satisfy the need or desire of people. Once you identify the need or desire of a group of people, you can decide the product or service which can satisfy that need or desire. Why do people demand goods? Consumers have unlimited wants. They demand goods to satisfy their wants. Utility is the amount of satisfaction you derive from consuming a product. It is the pleasure that consuming something provides. Utility means one satisfying power of a commodity. Producers want to learn utility because they want to maximize profit. Consumers want to learn utility because they want to maximize utility. Producers and consumers want to learn utility. Do you know what is utility? Utility is one satisfying power. It is a subjective concept. It is an internal feeling. It's variable. What is not utility? Utility cannot be measured. It is not measurable. It is not inherent in the commodity. It is totally different from usefulness and it is not pleasure. Utility is a subjective concept. It depends upon the person. For one consumer, one particular product is having utility, and for another, the utility is zero. It is an internal feeling of the consumer, and it varies with the customer to customer, and for the same customer, with time, it changes. A particular product has utility for the customer for some period of time, and after that, no utility or utility decreases. Can you measure utility? It is not measurable. What is a scale? Centimeter, gram? No, you cannot use any unit at all. But we can assume that utility is measurable and say this much units of utility this product has. And another product, the utility is this much units. To make a comparative study, we can measure utility. We can assume that we can measure utility. Utility is not inherent in the commodity. It is not the commodity, it is the internal feeling of the consumer. It is not usefulness. But for some consumers, they have utility. Utility is the pleasure that consuming something provides. But utility is not always pleasure. Consider you are sick and go to a hospital. You get an injection there. It is not a pleasurable experience, but it has utility. Then what is utility? Utility means one satisfying power of a commodity. The focus of economics is to understand the problem of scarcity. How individuals get optimal satisfaction. There is scarcity. And how can you get optimal satisfaction, maximum satisfaction? And utility explains how individuals and economies aim to gain optimal satisfaction in dealing with scarcity. Types of utility. Total utility, marginal utility. Let us assume that utility is measurable and you are taking apples. First apple, the utility is 30. Second apple, the total utility goes to 55. For the first apple, the utility is 30, and for the second apple, utility is not 30, it is only 25. And 25 is the marginal utility. But the total utility is 55, 30 plus 25. Total utility is the sum of utilities from the successive consumption. For the first one it is 30, second one the marginal utility is 25 but total utility is 55. And for the third apple, the marginal utility is 20 and the total utility is 75 for the 3 apples. And it goes on. What is marginal utility? Marginal here does not mean minor or beside the point, but its literal Latin meaning of additional or extra. Marginal utility is the extra utility from an extra unit of the product. The marginal utility of the first apple is 30. The marginal utility of the second apple is 25. And the marginal utility of the third apple is 20. Marginal utility means an additional or extra or incremental utility. Marginal utility is the change in the total utility that results from 1 unit change in consumption of the commodity within a given period of time. When a person increases the consumption of apples from 1 apple to 2 apples, the total utility increases from 30 to 55. The marginal utility here would be 25 units of the second apple consumed. Marginal utility is delta TU divided by delta Q, where delta TU is the change in total utility and delta Q is the change in quantity. Here it is 55 minus 30 divided by 2 minus 1, 25. Total utility is the sum of marginal utility of each successive units of consumption. Total utility of 3 apples is 75. It is the sum of 30 plus 25 plus 20. So we have learned what is total utility and what is marginal utility. Look at the table. The number of apples are given in the first column. Total utility is given in the second column. Marginal utility is given in the third column. Study the table and use your analytical skills. We are going to examine them in the next session. Be prepared for that. This session is the continuation of the previous session. If you have not analyzed the table, go back to the previous session and analyze the table. Let us start. One column is positive, which is that column, total utility. One column is diminishing, which is that column, marginal utility. One column is increasing, which is that column, total utility. And one column is increasing but at a diminishing rate. Total utility column is increasing at a diminishing rate. How you observe that? One column falls to 0, which is that column, marginal utility. Marginal utility falls to 0, 30, 25, 20, 15, 10, 5 and 0. At one particular point, total utility remains a constant. 6 apples, total utility is 105, and for the 7th apple, total utility is 105. No increase. How you notice that? Dash becomes maximum when dash becomes 0. Total utility becomes maximum when marginal utility becomes 0. How you notice that? When marginal utility is 0, total utility is 105, maximum. And how you noticed marginal utility is negative. After 0, for the 8th apple, it becomes negative, negative 5, then negative 10 and negative 15. When dash falls to 0, dash starts diminishing. What is it? When marginal utility falls to 0, total utility starts diminishing. Total utility goes to 105 when marginal utility is 0, and then 100, 90, 75. It starts diminishing. So these are the observations, and we find you have good analytical skills if you have observed all these characteristics from the table. Let us analyze our findings using graphs. In the first graph, total utility is given, and the second graph, marginal utility is given. Number of apples is given on the x-axis and utility is given in the y-axis. Total utility, you can see that, is increasing first, then reaches the maximum point and then starts to decreasing. Marginal utility decreases and falls to 0 and then becomes negative. And an important point is, when marginal utility becomes 0, total utility is maximum 105. We have seen that. These graphs clearly helps us to understand our findings. Marginal utility analysis. A consumer spends his given income on different commodities to attain maximum satisfaction. The objective is to get maximum satisfaction. We are using marginal utility analysis to study the behavior of the consumer, how he spends his given income on different commodities. This is the subject matter of our study. We are using certain economic laws for that. And you know that we can make economic laws based on certain assumptions. What we are going to study? We are going to study the laws, the assumptions, the limitations and their applications. Marginal utility analysis. There are two laws, law of diminishing marginal utility and the law of EQUI-MARGINAL utility. EQUI-MARGINAL utility means the law of equilibrium utility. They are not opposite laws. The law of EQUI-MARGINAL utility is an extension of law of diminishing marginal utility. Law of diminishing marginal utility applies to one product and law of EQUI-MARGINAL utility applies to two or more than two products. The law of EQUI-MARGINAL utility is also known as the law of equilibrium utility, law of substitution, law of maximum satisfaction. So we have to study only two laws, law of diminishing marginal utility and law of EQUI-MARGINAL utility. And we have already studied that law of EQUI-MARGINAL utility is only an extension of law of diminishing marginal utility. So let us start with law of diminishing marginal utility. Law of diminishing marginal utility. Who is your favorite singer? Which is your favorite song? You listen a song of your favorite singer released just now. First time listening, second time, third time, fourth time. You can feel that the amount of utility you derive from listening to the song repeatedly increases as you continue listening. However, after a certain point of time, you will start to become less satisfied listening to the song. 10 times, 20 times, 100 times, you will eventually derive negative utility. You will get sick of listening to it. You will have to wait for a few days. And if you still continues listening, you will have to wait for a few days before you feel like listening to the song again. It may take days for you to get back its original utility value again. Law of diminishing marginal utility states that the additional benefit which a person derives from a given increase of his stock of thing diminishes with every increase in the stock that he already has. The law sounds deeply psychological, and in a way it is. It fits how we feel about most things or services. This is an economic argument. The first thing chosen will of course be the most valuable. If the person choosing is being thoughtful, he will choose the most valuable first, of course. It would be silly to choose the least desirable first. The next thing will be less valuable. The last will be least valuable. And that's the law of diminishing marginal utility. We have learned the law of diminishing marginal utility. The additional benefit which a person derives from a given increase of his stock of thing diminishes with every increase in the stock that he already has. But what about unidentical goods? What about gold and cash? What about if there is a time gap? And if there are substitutes, and what is a unit we can select? We have considered the example of consuming apples. First apple, second apple. And if second is not an apple but an orange, how this law works? And what about gold? You get 1 gram of gold, then another gram of gold. Is there diminishing marginal utility? Cash, you get 10,000 rupees as your first month salary, second month salary is 50,000, third month salary is 90,000. Are you happy? Suppose there is time gap. You are listening that song for the first day only one time, second day one time, third day one time. If there is time gap, how this law works? And if there are substitute products available, how this law works? Think about that. And these are the limitations of this law. Assumptions. The basic assumptions on which the utility analysis rests are measurability, independent, marginal utility of money is equal to a constant. The utility analysis depends upon these basic assumptions. Let us consider one by one. 1. Measurability of utility. In this assumption, utility is measurable. That is the assumption. That is only an assumption. Whether it is measurable or not is a different issue. We assume that utility is measurable. That you can compare the size. How much one level of utility is greater than another. Then what is the unit? What is the unit of utility if it is measurable? Some economists call it utils, U-T-I-L-S. It is an imaginary unit. Suppose the utility of an apple is 10 and that of an orange is 5. That means apple has twice the utility that of orange. We say that the utility of apple is equal to 10 utils and the utility of orange is equal to 5 utils. Marshall argued utility is measurable in terms of money. That is, we can measure utility in terms of money, rupees. The amount of money which a person is prepared to pay for it rather than without it is a measure of utility. How it happens? Suppose the utility of a product is 10. The price of the product is 5. Then the person purchases it 6. Then he purchases 7. He purchases 8. He purchases 9. He purchases 10. He purchases. When the price of the commodity is 11, he stops purchasing the product. So we say that the utility of the product is 10. And it can be measured in terms of money. And this is the first assumption about utility. The second assumption is the hypothesis of independent utilities. The utility you get from the whole collection of goods is the sum of the separate utilities of the goods. That is, utility is additive. Separate utilities of different goods can be added to obtain the total sum of utilities of all the goods purchased. Utility of one product is 10, the other products 20, the other products 30, then the total utility is 10 plus 20 plus 30, that is 60. You can add utilities and we assume that it is independent. The third assumption is the constancy of the marginal utility of money. We have seen that the marginal utility of goods is diminishing. But we here assume that the marginal utility of money is constant. Is it true? True or not, we assume that it is constant. Marshall measured marginal utility in terms of money. Marginal utility of goods diminish, but marginal utility of money remains constant. This is the assumption. Applications of diminishing marginal utility. You can find application of the concept of diminishing marginal utility in determination of prices. Let me ask you a question. Why water, which is so very essential and useful to life, has such a low price? Which diamonds, which are quite unnecessary, have such a price? Let me repeat the question. Why water, which is so very essential and useful to life, has such a low price, which diamonds, which are quite unnecessary, have such a price? This is water-diamond paradox. Do you know the answer? Adam Smith, the father of economics, was greatly surprised with water-diamond paradox. He could not solve the water-diamond paradox. But modern economists can solve it with the concept of marginal utility. How can they solve it? The total utility of a commodity does not determine the price of a commodity. That is the principle. The total utility of a commodity does not determine the price of a commodity. Marginal utility is important determinant in price. The water is available abundant, so the marginal utility is 0. Therefore, price is also 0. The diamonds are scarce and their marginal utility is quite high. This is the reason why their prices are high. You can find application of diminishing marginal utility in finding out answers to why the demand curve slopes downwards and the concept of consumer plus. You can also find an application in fiscal policy of the government. The government redistribute income so as to increase the welfare of people. Transfer of income from the rich to the poor will increase the welfare of the community. How? How can you say that transfer of income from the rich to the poor will increase the welfare of the community? You can explain it with diminishing marginal utility. How? The gain in utility of the poor person is greater than the loss of utility of the rich man. Therefore, the total utility of the two persons taken together will increase. Hence, transfer of income from the rich to the poor will increase the welfare of the community. So, even the government can take advantage of the principle of diminishing marginal utility when they make fiscal policies. Law of EQUI-MARGINAL utility. The consumer will distribute his money income between the goods in such a way that the utility derived from the last rupee spent on each good is equal. Every consumer has unlimited wants. The money at his disposal is limited. The consumer has to make a choice when he buys. He compares the satisfaction he obtains. If he thinks the utility of the commodity is greater than the utility of money, he buys. As he buys more and more, the utility of successive units begin to diminish. He stops further purchase of the commodity at a point where the marginal utility is equal to price. He purchases a product, say apple, when marginal utility of apple is equal to price of apple. Suppose there are two or more products. Consumer's equilibrium with a single commodity is marginal utility is equal to price. But when you have to compare two goods, you have to take not only utility but also price also. But when, suppose there are two goods X and Y on which the consumer has to spend his given income, the consumer's behavior is based on two factors: marginal utility of X and Y, the prices of goods X and Y. You can make it mathematically. MUX by PX is equal to MUY by PY is equal to MUN by PN is equal to MUM, where MUM is the marginal utility of money. If MUX by PX is greater than MU by PY, then the consumer will substitute X for Y. As a result, marginal utility of X will fall. This law is also known as the law of maximum satisfaction, because a consumer tries to get the maximum satisfaction from his limited resources by so planning his expenditure that the marginal utility of a rupee spent in one use is the same as the marginal utility of a rupee spent on another use. It is known as the law of substitution because consumer continuously substituting one good for another till he gets the maximum satisfaction. It is called the law of indifference because the maximum satisfaction has been achieved by equating the marginal utility in all the uses. The consumer thus becomes indifferent to readjust his expenditure unless some change taken place in his income or the prices of the commodities. Law of substitution is applied to all problems of allocation of scarce resources. The law of maximum satisfaction is meaningful general statement of how consumers behave. The focus of economics is to understand the problem of scarcity. Utility explains how individuals and economies aim to gain optimal satisfaction in dealing with scarcity.